Hey, I'm back with some further analysis on whether or not WoW has become too dumbed down over the years. In the last video, I talked about combat, leveling, questing, and dungeons. Those are all elements that take place before and at max level, so now I'm going to talk about endgame systems exclusively, specifically progression at max level and raiding. And before I start, let me state that even though I'm calling this an analysis, this is a very narrow viewpoint and perspective of a huge game. I won't cover everything, but if you think that there's something critical I'm missing, let me know and I'll try to bring it up in a future video. I'll talk about the easy thing first, raids. The argument is kinda simple. Raiding is dumbed down and simple and doesn't have the epic feel that it once had. For the sake of the analysis, we can separate raiding into a couple of components: logistics, combat, and rewards. The first raids used 40 people. 40 people. Now think about 40 people in the same room as you, right now. That's more people than it takes to run a Walmart, and none of you guys are getting paid. I'm overreaching, but I'd bet $1 that while a lot of Warcraft's first players were fans of the franchise, most of the pioneer raiders already had some experience from MMOs like EverQuest. The early community understood the logistics of large-scale PvE content, the grinding, the farming, the gear checks, the dedication. Experienced players knew what to expect. Inexperienced players didn't raid, at least not for a while. There was little telling what players of the future would enjoy, but some of these indicators came from how the world outside of WoW engaged gaming. During Classic WoW, Blizzard was also trying out smaller raids to suit teams that couldn't hold up these sorts of numbers. Smaller size raids meant teams were able to get their numbers together faster. But this also meant problems with raid composition. It didn't feel great when your team was set up, but there was no shaman for bloodlust or a druid for battle res. And this felt worse with 10-man versions of raids were created. Skills had to be shifted around and duplicated, and some had to go all together. And players didn't like some of these changes. This was class homogenization, they said. It didn't feel good when classes felt the same. I might be the lucky one, but in all my years of WoW, I've only seen this argument in like forums and interviews. This argument just doesn't seem to have a whole lot of teeth when you're in-game and you have your team together and you're doing just fine. When Warlords of Draenor launched, many buttons were removed in the great ability pruning. I main a prop paladin, so I don't have the knowledge to make a really good presentation, but I will say this. I am really grateful that over time I no longer have to refresh a seal every few seconds or minutes. And thank you for the upcoming version of Blessing of Kings and Legion. Now someone else can cast this new Sacred Shield on me. By the way, 10, that's gonna be you. Finally, the actual raid combat. I'm kinda puzzled why critics feel that WoW's raid combat has felt easier over time. One actual mechanic that was a barrier to overcome was resistance, but that mostly affected the logistics needed to complete the encounter. You needed to farm the gear. It's different now. The logistics are less of a challenge because we have flex raiding and the spreading of raid-related skills and buffs. That was traded for creating raid encounters that have become more and more complicated with each expansion. It's a difference between Gar and Paragons. What would Gar be like with a boss mod that tracked CC refresh alerts for each target? What if Onyxia didn't require resist gear? How difficult would Paragons be without boss mods, or if it was never first experienced in beta testing? WoW's raid encounters may feel forgiving because of the knowledge bases that we have today, but there's definitely been a large shift from the logistics of team building and organization to the actual raid. And as for rewards, I'll go to that in a second, but concerning raids at least, much more gear drops now than before. Thanks to stat conversions, the likelihood of useless gear has gone down dramatically. And now for like the toughest part of the game to talk about. This was really hard. We're going to talk about max level progression. So here's the kind of critical thesis. Today's players find it far too easy to gear up at max level. Thanks to the numerous ways gear is acquired, raiding has become accessible too quickly. The path to progressing into higher level content is much shorter, and thanks to content like LFR, the bar itself is lowered. It's a loaded statement, I know. Let's start with the idea of catch-up gear. These were epics intended for players who were behind to use non-raiding activities to catch up to their friends and guildmates. To flesh this out a little bit, we need to go all the way back to Burning Crusade to see where it started. Back in the early days of a tank, this is how you would progress. You hit the level cap, Then you get the necessary rep for each faction to get the key to unlock heroics, to get rep, to get more gear, to get defense cap for heroics and raids. And once you got all of that, you're now ready for raiding Karazhan. And you did that week after week after week until your team could move on, or you moved on, if ever. Gearing took a long time to do back in those days, and players were often trying to play catch-up. Before catch-ups were available, budding raid guilds only had a few options. You could be guild number 1 and be awesome. Players would just come running to you. Or you can do what guild number 2 does. Poach aggressively and try to bring in more people than you lose. If neither of that happens, you're guild 3. You failed, and you become the feeder guild for guilds 1 and 2. I was there, and it sucked. But then came a new Justice Badge vendor that gave players access to Black Temple level gear. Some raiders were pretty damn pissed that their efforts in earlier raids were nullified by this gear and felt offended to see these heroic babies trying to get into Black Temple and Sunwell raids. But more players understood Blizzard's reasoning. The previous system alienated newer players and alts, and while raid teams often ran older content to gear fresh characters up, it also used up a lot of time, and the constant circling back sometimes led to burnout. And there we have it. Catch-up mechanisms were created to help players catch up and alleviate the stress on teams to re-gear and farm older content. Let's fast forward to today. Now things are kind of weird. Catch-ups are still there, but now there are a heck of a lot more of them, at varying degrees. Today there's high-end crafting, baleful gear, empowered Apexis, garrison caches, world bosses, invasions, time walking, mythic dungeons, and LFR. That's a lot of epics. And speaking of epics, players who've experienced endgame progression before the advent of catch-up mechanisms understood both the brutality and the accomplishment of earning an epic piece of loot. I recall getting more compliments about my gear during BC than at any other time that I've played. I'm not counting transmog stuff though, of course. But it felt good to be looked up to and lord over the lesser players with my purples. Back then, gear was your trophy. That was your measure of accomplishment. But a few really big things happened along the way that changed that measuring stick. There's external websites like Warcraft logs for raiders. There's gear score for pugs. Later, Blizzard revealed item level. Something happened before all of that though, at the start of the Lich King, which is often referred to as the peak of WoW's popularity. It was the introduction of the achievement system. I mentioned achievements earlier, but with reference to gear, that it was the way that players displayed their accomplishments. Today, it's achievements that fill that role. Ahead of the curve, mounts, raid metas, titles. For a long time, gear has meant less of a token of prestige, but it still continues to serve its purpose, a means to earn an achievement, a tool. To top all this off, transmog pretty much buried the purple-colored lens of yesterday, because who knows what the heck people are wearing under that. I talked a little bit about progression, but here's the real question. Is all of this an actual problem, or just a perceived one? When I explained the progression path back in the Burning Crusade, there was very little wiggle room around that path. Some players were lucky enough to have their raid teams let them into raids they had no business being in for the purpose of gearing them faster. Most players though were at the bottom in the rat race, struggling to be relevant. The critique of WoW's progression comes from looking at the whole picture and examining all of its parts, which I'm doing to some degree. The reality though is that players find one or two parts, and they make it their own. Today there's a path for each player to choose and follow. Lifestyles change and the game experience can now change with it. The beginning player can go hardcore, and then become a casual parent, then the casual parent of a beginner, and so on. And that's what makes WoW's progression system much more complicated than it at first seems. It's as short or as long as the player's time allows. It's also as easy or as hard as the player desires. You made it to the end. I made it to the end. Yes! Like I said, this wasn't easy. I know that this argument is one of many dead horses, but I hope I hit a few interesting points. So let me know what you think in a comment below, and hopefully my next video will be a lot more effortless. Yeah. I'm Soul. Stay breezy. Bye-bye.